All right, so we're going to talk about Tim O'Brien's Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy? This story was published as a short story first, then it was modified and included in Going After Cacciato by Tim O'Brien, and then in The Things They Carried, in the chapter notes, or the story notes, O'Brien gives Norman Bowker credit for having suggested it, and also says that Norman Bowker wasn't crazy about it. So you're going to see two colors of highlights. The yellow highlights, these ones down here, they're going to relate to Speaking of Courage and parallels between this story and Speaking of Courage. And the orange highlights are going to relate to other stories in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. First, I'll deal with the yellow ones, Speaking of Courage, and then I'll deal with the other ones. So many of the yellow ones relate to the fact that Paul Berlin is traumatized and he needs someone to talk to, and he imagines talking to his dad. So you may find that that's pretty similar to Norman Bowker in Speaking of Courage, who gets traumatized and who imagines driving around the lake, speaking to his absent father. Here, Paul Berlin wishes to get clean, something else that Norman Bowker is seeking in Speaking of Courage. Here, Paul Berlin obsesses about the smells and textures of the muck in Vietnam, something that Norman Bowker wrestles with in Speaking of Courage. Here's another example of Paul Berlin wanting to speak to his dad and hopefully make him proud. Here we have Paul Berlin thinking again about the sights and scents and smells of the paddies in Vietnam. Here we have another example of Paul Berlin imagining talking to his dad, and in this case his dad's eyes are stern, so we have to question the relationship between them and the extent to which Paul Berlin wants to please him. Here we have a time reference, which is interesting, because in Speaking of Courage we learn two things about time. Number one, Norman Bowker can tell time without a watch. And number two, Kiowa's wristwatch is one of the last things that Norman sees when he goes under. And here we have mortar rounds that are falling. That was happening in Speaking of Courage, and that's what led to Kiowa's getting sucked into the muck field. Here, Billy Boy Watkins, when they find him, his eyes are wide open, and when Kiowa goes under, his eyes are wide open too. Another example of an imaginary conversation with the dad to be attentive to. Okay, that's it for Speaking of Courage. I'm going to go back to the top, and then I'm going to toggle back and forth between Charming Billy and The Things They Carried. So the first one that reminded me of The Things They Carried is this one, which has to do with being very quiet. And it reminds me of the listening patrol, where the soldiers went up into the mountains and they became very anxious and nervous because of the extreme quiet, and it made their imaginations go wild. These orange highlights remind me of Lieutenant Jimmy Cross. The first reminds me of Jimmy Cross because he would dig foxholes and sit in them and hold Martha's letters with the tips of his fingers. And down here, after Ted Lavender died, Jimmy Cross made a number of promises to himself about how he'd be a better leader the next day. And in this case, Paul Berlin does the same thing. He makes a whole bunch of promises about what he'll do the next day. And that repetition of he would, in some ways suggests that maybe he actually won't. It's just too much to bear. Got another one right down here. This is a description of what happened to Billy Boy and his injury that led to his heart attack. He lost a limb, and in The Things They Carried, there's a number of characters who step on a rigged landmine, and they lose a limb. And then some of the most interesting ones to me that relate to other stories are these. In this one, when they find Billy Boy, he's described as if he's just executed a long and dangerous dive. In The Things They Carried, when Kiowa is found, he too is described with the same comparison, as like he's a diver. That's in a chapter called In the Field that I haven't assigned yet, but perhaps by the time you see the screencast, you will have read it. In addition, when they find Billy Boy Watkins, he is green and covered with algae. In that same moment that I just showed you from In the Field, here we have Kiowa, who's covered with a bluish-green mud. So imagine you're Norman Bowker reading this story, thinking about Kiowa. You're going to have some things that remind you of that, okay? Up here we have a description of the search for Billy Boy Watkins. Number 1, the soldiers have to wade in. Number 2, they use their rifle butts. And number 3, with their rifle butts, they probe for Billy Boy Watkins. Well, in the things they carried in the chapter In the Field, when they go look for Kiowa, they're searching with the butts of their weapons. They're using those butts of their weapons as probes, and they are wading across the field. So there are 3 really tight parallels between the 2 scenarios in which a soldier is lost and a soldier is found. The last one is just kind of a fun one, because you can tell a true war story with a lot of criteria. But here, Tim O'Brien throws in the word funny, which is interesting because the story of Billy Boy Watkins is not funny, but he's really commenting on the irony. Hope you enjoyed the screencast. Hope you enjoy the novel. Hope you enjoy Tim O'Brien, and I hope you read some more of him.